Hello, I'm Bella Talbot, Brand Executive at DK Eyewitness.
And I'm Alex Pathé, Editor at DK Eyewitness.
And welcome to Where to Go, where every fortnight we find out more about the world's favourite travel destinations with the people who know those places best. And where are we going today, Alex?
Today, Bella, we are off to the USA's largest state, Alaska. So to give you some context of this region's epic proportions, it's more than double the size of the second largest state, with incredibly varied landscapes and plenty to see and do. I think we're going to have so much to discuss, so I'm really looking forward to this one. In fact, I've just been working on our new book to the USA's national parks, which is coming out next year, and we talk about some of Alaska's national parks, and it just sounds beautiful. So I think this is going to be an absolute romp. So without further ado, who have we got joining us?
Today's guest is Lisa Maloney. Lisa Maloney is an award-winning writer and editor whose research has seen her sleeping in a haunted hotel, being body slammed by a masked luchador, and trekking across the Alaska wilderness. Lisa has served as senior editor at Alaska Magazine and written hundreds of articles for publications such as National Geographic, Condé Nast Traveler, and the Wall Street Journal, to name but a few. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Lisa. It's great to have you. Thank you so much. So, as usual, we'll begin with learning a little bit more about our guest, Lisa, followed by her all-important recommendations of where to go and insider knowledge of Alaska. Then we'll hear about ways to make the most positive impact when you visit the state.
So Lisa, tell us how your love affair of exploring Alaska began.
Well, it did not start as a love affair.
Oh, okay.
My father was in the military, which is how a lot of people end up here. There are a couple of military bases because I suppose we're in a very strategically important location.
Yeah.
And prior to this, we were stationed in what was West Germany at the time. And when I was told that our next duty station was going to be Alaska, I think I was 8 or 9 years old, and I had no clue what an Alaska was. And I asked my mother, and she said there will be a lot of mountains, and there will be snow, and there will be ice. And my immediate response was, that means there won't be any horses. I don't want to go. Because I was just at that age. I was a wannabe horse girl. I never turned into a horse girl for real, but horses were my obsession. And I was just crushed at the idea that we'd go to somewhere with no horses. And, my mother quickly said, don't worry, they put special shoes on them so they don't slip on the ice, which in talking to friends who do have horses here, that is actually true. I can confirm there are horses here, but when we moved here, what actually captivated my interest more than anything, believe it or not, was not the big mountains in the distance, because again, I was 8 years old. It was a green belt just down the block in the city, just a stand of trees that had been preserved as part of the deliberate landscaping. And I was convinced that that was where all my friends lived, and I would pester my family to go let me play with the sticks in the mud and the trees, and I had this little pocket knife, and I was convinced I was going to learn how to whittle things out of the sticks. I never did anything more than make them pointy. And all of that is to say that was my introduction to Alaska's nature at the scale of an 8-year-old. And then as time went on and I grew up a bit, my family wasn't outdoorsy at all, really. We did a little bit of river fishing a couple of times, and that was it. But I heard people talking about the outdoors. I heard people talking about hiking. And one thing led to another, and I decided I'd better try these things for myself. And I've just never looked back. That's really where I fell in love more than anything, I would say. And it's what keeps me here. More than 30 years later, the rest of my family has left because winters can be hard. But I am still here because I can't imagine living anywhere else, really.
Wow.
That's
really interesting that the rest of your family left, but you stuck it out. You toughed it out.
Yeah, it feels that way in the winter sometimes, I will admit. But there are rewards for being here all year round. A lot of the tourist brochures show the summer because that's the easiest time to come here. And it's when the bulk of people come, it's a beautiful time to be here. But there are upsides to the winter too. I mean, you can walk outside and see the northern lights overhead. If you like skiing, and I very much love cross-country skiing, this is a wonderful place to be. You haven't seen a winter until you've gone outside at 20 below is about the coldest that it gets in my part of the state. But that's, and I apologize, that's Fahrenheit, but that is cold enough that you can get hoarfrost. And I'm not sure if you're familiar. It's HOAR frost. And it's when the air is so cold that you get ice crystals forming on everything. So it's almost like the world around you has sprouted little tiny feathers.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a magical sort of thing. So there are some compensations for putting up with the cold and the dark in the wintertime.
Absolutely. Lisa, I love the fact that we've started an episode on the US's largest state by talking about this tiny patch of greenery from your childhood that catalyzed a love affair with the outdoors. That's amazing. But I mean, Alaska is such a vast state that we'll obviously never be able to cover it in one episode. But could you tell us about a few favourite areas of yours within the state?
Absolutely. So maybe it would help to explain how I tend to subdivide the state first as well. You can't really see me, but I like to joke that everybody has their Alaska map on them. So if anybody listening takes their right hand and you fold back the last three fingers, so you've got just your pointer finger and your thumb sticking out, and then if you hold it so the back of your hand is facing you, so you're looking at the back of your own hand and you've got your pointer finger going down into the left and your thumb down into the right, that's your Alaska map. That's more or less the shape of Alaska. So your hand is Alaska and your wrist is Canada. Right?
Very cool.
Brilliant.
So when you look at that, your thumb is something that we call the panhandle, or if you're interested in cruises, you might hear it referred to as the inside passage, because there are a whole lot of islands and things that help protect ships going up that way from the open ocean. And that is where the city of Juneau, which is the state's capital, is. So you might have heard of that. And then your pointer finger, that would be the Aleutian Islands. It's this wonderful arc of treeless, very windy, beautiful islands where you'll see a lot of seabirds nesting and lots of whales and things like that. That's southwest Alaska. And then the sort of web in between the two along the bottom part of your hand, that is south central Alaska, which is where I live. And then going up from there, you've got the interior of Alaska, which you might imagine is the inside of the back of your hand. And then the very top edge of your hand would be the Arctic. So I feel like that's sort of a long answer already, but that's just how big Alaska is. It's how most people will sort of divide that up to make it manageable. I'm very biased towards South Central, not only because I live here, but also because you can't get everywhere in Alaska on a road. You cannot drive everywhere. There just aren't roads connecting a lot of the places to one another. But South Central Alaska is basically the hub of the state's road system. So I can drive to a lot of really beautiful and diverse places from here. I can go south and I can be on the coast within, depending on where I'm going, an hour or an hour and a half, let's say. I can drive north, and that takes me a lot longer. It'll take me, according to Google Maps, if you don't ever stop to eat or take pictures or look at anything, it takes you about 6 hours. For most human beings, it takes about 8 hours to drive up to Fairbanks, which is smack in the middle of Alaska and has a very different topography, very different terrain. But I can get lots of places without paying for a plane ticket or a boat ride. Speaking of boats, if I could claim a second favorite part of the state, it would actually be southeast, just because even though it's still part of the same state, it's far enough away. You know, the nearest communities are about an hour by jet to get there, to give you an idea of the distance. And you can't drive there because the roads don't connect through. There are 2 little communities in there that you could get to from the Yukon Territory in Canada. And they're called Haines and Skagway. Those are the only ones you can drive to in any capacity. Aside from that, you're getting there by plane, or you're getting there by cruise ship or state ferry, or maybe you're lucky enough to have your own yacht or your own sailboat, because some of the communities there are very popular destinations for that kind of travel. So it's the same state. You speak the same language, it's the same general culture as the rest of Alaska, and at the same time, it's so different from the way that I live that I really enjoy visiting there and seeing, more of the waterman's life, I guess.
That was a really wonderful evocation of the geography of Alaska. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you for the visual. I'm going to use that. My next question is, before we sort of dive into the best things to do, what is your absolute favourite thing about Alaska?
I'd say just being outside, if that's not too vague. Just anything that gives us a chance to connect with something that's larger than ourselves. And nature here is very much larger than any of us or than all of us put together.
To kick things off, we're going to ask you to give us a quick fire tour of Alaska. We're going to name a few categories and you have to suggest just one thing. Are you ready?
I'll do my best.
Wonderful, thank you. So the first category, what was your favourite view?
The view from the top of a place called Portage Pass, which is a hiking trail just outside the small town of Whittier. If I can only take visitors to one place, if they're here for a short visit and I want to show them something beautiful, and they're able to walk almost a mile up sort of an old road, I take them there because in the one direction, you are looking at Portage Glacier, which is everything that you might imagine a glacier to be if you've ever seen, marketing pictures. It's this beautiful, glistening, gigantic chunk of blue-white ice that is just pockmarked and almost corrugated. It's got amazing texture to it, and the sun or the lack of sun bounces off of it in all kinds of interesting ways. And then there's a lake of meltwater in front of it, which is an ever-present constant for almost every glacier because all that ice is melting and the water has to go somewhere. And then if you turn around and look the other way, you'll see the little town of Whittier below you. It's a very small town. It's about 300 people, more or less, in population. And it's on this little nub of land. And then beyond it, it's almost dark electric blue water. And that is called Passage Canal, but the more relevant and interesting part of that for visitors, I think, is that it's actually part of Prince William Sound, which is a region of Alaska that's quite famous for its rich wildlife and aquatic adventures. So there's this beautiful water there that is in some way protected, but at the same time a direct link into some of the wildest waters you can get to. And you can see all of that in one relatively short little walk from town.
Okay, so next category is day activity.
You can probably guess hiking.
From what I know about you, Lisa, I thought it was going to be hiking.
It's a giveaway, yeah.
And your favourite thing to eat?
I like to say that most major communities in Alaska have their own fad food, or they're all aficionados of a food for some reason. Down the Kenai Peninsula, which is south of me, it seems to be barbecue. Here in town, it seems to be pizza. You'll find all kinds of eclectic and interesting pizza joints. Go up to Fairbanks and it's Thai food. And of course, I love a good seafood dish. And you can get wonderful fresh seafood almost everywhere here in Alaska, but maybe I'm guilty of taking that a little bit for granted. So if I had to name my absolute favorite food, there is a food truck here in town called 907 Bagel Company. They're relatively new, and they make steamed bagels, which have been hard to get up here for a while. People who know about bagels are always ranting about the lack of good bagels up here, real bagels. And they make the real deal. They make steamed bagels, and then they make sandwiches out of them. And I think it's boiled bagels. I'm showing my ignorance. I'm not a bagel aficionado. They make boiled bagels. That's the real deal. But then the steam comes in because they make these wonderful sandwiches with different cheeses and eggs and bacon and all kinds of wonderful peppers and different vegetables that they'll throw in there. And then they steam those. So might sound great, it might sound horrible, but I promise you it's wonderful to eat. It just becomes this sort of wonderful, gooey, chewy amalgam of delicious tastes and textures, and they hand it to you in sort of this foil packet that they have to use to keep any of the delicious bits from escaping. And you unpeel it as you go. It's not runny, so it's actually reasonable to eat, right? But it's not light food, but it's so delicious. So if I were to wake up any morning and say, what's the food I most want today? I would be looking on Facebook to see where that food truck is so I can hunt them down.
Oh, that is such good. That's such a good local insider tip. That sounds so delicious. I think I might have been drooling slightly when you were explaining that to me then. And related to that, Lisa, what about your favorite thing to drink?
There is something called a shrub that I had at a restaurant in Juneau, and I believe it is a vinegar-based extraction of botanicals. So, for example, they had a
Wow.
juniper shrub, I believe, while I was there.
Oh, wow.
So, and I believe then they add sort of a bubbling component to it, and it's just lovely and wonderful. So for me, shrubs from down in Juneau, which I've never seen anywhere else, but I think they are a thing that pops up occasionally in other places. And they make them with some local botanical ingredients, though, and it's just they're great. They're refreshing. They're light. They're wonderful.
That sounds lovely. So, your last category before we end the quick fire round, your favourite museum or gallery?
Okay, so I am biased because almost every little town in Alaska, and this is not hyperbole, I am not exaggerating, almost every little town in Alaska has an excellent small museum.
Oh, wow.
But my absolute favorite, if I really have to name just one, is a place called the Alaska Native Heritage Center, which is here in Anchorage. It's, for the most part, only open during the summer. They do open during the winter for special occasions. And they are probably the best place in the entire state, which would also make them the best place in the world for getting an introduction to the indigenous cultures of Alaska. Because I think it's pretty natural, actually, for people who are coming here to expect that maybe there would be sort of one cohesive type of indigenous culture here. But the state is so large and so varied, and people had to develop different technologies and different life ways to deal with the different climates that we have here, because the north of Alaska is going to be very different from the south, and the west will be very different from the east, and so on, just because they're so geographically separated. So at this Heritage Center, you can get an amazing overview of cultures throughout the state. And they have what I believe they call the village tour. And what it really is recreated traditional dwellings from all over the state. So all the different ways that people lived, they have life-size recreations, and then they'll have a docent or a guide who will take you around. You can explore on your own too, but it's much better to go with the guide, and they'll help you understand what you're looking at. And I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's fascinating to see how people used to live, and then you also learn about how people still live, because, of course, Alaska's indigenous people are still very much a part of life here. And you can see examples of their traditional arts, like dancing and drumming, and sometimes they have these multicultural days where they'll have people from all over the state or even all over the world representing different cultures, sharing, right? Everybody shows up and they share something of what they have, and then they learn about others. And it's just a really neat place to visit and a neat place to have in the community as well.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. You've completed the quick fire round, and there were so many great recommendations in there. Well done. The pressure's off now.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so obviously we know your favourite activity is hiking. I didn't ask you too much more about it, but I'm now going to ask you potentially another quite tough question. Could you tell us a bit about some of your favourite hikes?
So I would say, keeping in mind, just to not to harp on it, but just to mention the size of Alaska again, I think it's, again, very natural for people who are coming here to want to see as much of the state as they can, or to see the entire state if they can. And looking at it on a map, depending on the scale of the map, that might be perfectly reasonable. But when you actually get here, it usually doesn't work that way unless you have a very long time. I like to say pick one region of the 5 we discussed and then plan on spending at least a week there. Realistically, every region is going to have some fine exemplar of an easy hike and a more ambitious hike. So no matter where you find yourself in the state, even if you're not near to the hikes I'm thinking of, there will be something that you absolutely should take the time to explore. As for me, though, I'll just stick to South Central, so sort of the on the road system, as we would say here, because that's where I live and so where I spend most of my time.
Mm.
I already mentioned Portage Pass out of Whittier. It's a beautiful hike, but it is uphill also. So for people who might like more of a not so uphill experience, you won't find very many genuinely flat hikes here, but we can come pretty close. So I'm thinking of a place called Exit Glacier, which is just outside of a town called Seward, Alaska. It's a very famous and popular cruise port, so often that's how people will know about Seward. And Exit Glacier is, I think, all told, you'll probably walk about 2 miles to walk out to a viewing platform that lets you see the toe of the glacier and then back. So you can actually see a glacier, which is really exciting. You can't get too close to it because, when people think of tidewater glaciers, the ones that come down from the mountains and meet the sea, they might think of calving, right? When chunks of ice fall off the glacier and plunk into the water, and it's really exciting and never gets old. But land-based glaciers do that too. And so it doesn't happen as often as with a tidewater glacier, but we don't want you, and you don't want you, to be standing underneath a piece of the glacier when it lets go. So the viewing platform is a safe distance away, and sometimes they will also put up little warning signs that say, we're closing the trail off, we're not letting you get too close because there might be an ice fall issue. I like to say we don't have enough warning signs to put a warning on everything in Alaska that could kill you, right? Because we're in an uncontrolled environment. So when we do actually put up a warning sign, I really hope people will take those seriously because they are there for a reason. I hope that doesn't make it sound like it's not a great hike. It is a wonderful hike. And it's really good for people of all abilities too, because there are benches along the way, and the entire thing is not wheelchair accessible, but good parts of it are. And I believe that if you have, say, a wheelchair or a walker or any sort of mobility assistance device, you can't get to the viewing platform because you'd have to go up some sort of shallow rock stairs, but you can get to a nice lookout point over what's called the Glacier Outwash Plain, I believe they call it. It's basically the floodplain at the base of the glacier, because occasionally water is always flowing out of the glacier, and occasionally the water will get backed up by ice that gets in the way of the outflow, and then it all lets go at once. And so the result of that cycle is just this sort of plain of relatively barren ground, but it's this beautiful wide expanse. So it's a nice counterpoint to the mountains around you. And they have pedestal binoculars, so they're permanently mounted there. And you can look from there, and usually you can actually see the toe of the glacier from there too. It's in the distance, but the binoculars make it feel like it's very close to you. So there you go. Sorry, I got lost in the wilderness almost. I'm remembering what it's like to be there, and I'm imagining, what I feel and what I see when I'm there. But that would be an easy hike.
Amazing.
For a more challenging hike, it's kind of natural to stay there because starting from the same place, and these are both in Kenai Fjords National Park, by the way, they're the only two maintained trails there. Starting from the same place, you can do a much more challenging hike called Harding Icefield. And what that does is it takes you up a mountain, because that is where most hikes in Alaska go. Sometimes they flirt with the idea with switchbacks, but you're almost always going up. And the advantage of that is it gives you, aside from a great workout, you get great views. This trail, if memory serves, is on paper about 8 miles round trip. Realistically, it's more like 10 miles round trip. And what you're going to do is you're going to walk up the mountainside alongside Exit Glacier, the glacier I just mentioned getting to the toe of. So now if you're willing to sweat for it, you can walk up the glacier, and you'll see why people call them rivers of ice, because from that perspective, it really looks like a waterfall of ice as it's sort of rippling in very, very, very slow motion. So it's basically frozen in time as it ripples down the mountainside. And where it's coming from is Harding Icefield, the name of the hike. And Icefield is the birthplace of glaciers, basically. So you might think of it as the glacier's headwaters. And in actual practice, as you get further up, you'll start to see it break over what seems like the horizon because it's actually just the mountain up above you that is covered in this massive sheet of ice. And it's like a desert of snow almost as you get closer and closer to it, because everything you see is going to be ice or snow, because the snow lingers there year round, of course, or piles of rocks that have been dragged there by the glacier and then deposited as that little bit of the ice melted out, because glaciers are constantly sculpting and reshaping the land, even now, right? And when you get there, I'm a little embarrassed because I've forgotten the name for it, but there is a specific name for when you see the tip of a mountain poking out from an ice field, because that's all you can see. The rest of it is covered. And you will see those. And you wouldn't want to go out onto the ice field or the glacier without training, right? Because there are holes and crevasses in the glacier that could very easily kill you. And, there actually are warning signs on glaciers a lot of the time, just so you know. So that tells you the magnitude. We've actually put a warning sign on it. We mean it. But even if there's no warning sign, just know glaciers are very dangerous places to actually walk upon. But looking at them from a distance is wonderful. And you can climb up the moraine when you get to the top of Harding Icefield, which is almost like a ridge of rocks that has been left by the moving glacier. You can climb up there and get amazing views. It feels like you're looking out forever over the ice. And it's just remarkable. And then on the way there, lest I make you think that you're just, toiling up this barren face, you're going through the alpine tundra also. And I love the alpine tundra because it's like a tiny microcosm. You'll see some of the same plants that you'd see in the forest, but in shrunken form because they're living in much harsher, more exposed conditions. So, for example, fireweed is a very common flower here. It grows on a tall stalk and it's got beautiful, bright pink flowers. There's a dwarf version of that grows in the tundra that's very tiny sometimes in some places. And so if you look at a tundra from the distance, like you're far, far away, you're not even on the mountain, it might look barren. But when you get close, you see it's just this riot of life with all these tiny plants. And there is lots of wildlife. So, no wildlife sighting in Alaska is guaranteed, but you can expect to probably see something while you're up there. You might see birds, you might see bears, but the place is alive. And if you're paying attention, you will see some evidence of that.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I feel like you've really conjured the beauty of not just the grandeur in terms of size, but when you're staring at a glacial landscape, the sense of kind of deep time that you're getting, and the way as you say, the way these are carving out landscapes over eons. It's just such an incredible, you feel so humbled, not just by size, but also by the kind of the time of span of these landscapes. That's just incredible, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. It's, I think that's what keeps me here more than anything. It's so big and I'm so small. And I think I've heard some people describe that as a vulnerable feeling, but to me, it feels good to be, to know that I'm a part of something bigger than me.
Absolutely, for sure. Thank you so much. So beyond what we've already talked about, Lisa, are there any absolute highlights that visitors to Alaska shouldn't miss when they're in the state?
I'm not sure if this is really a proper answer to the question, but what comes to me is that in this era of Instagram and social media, I feel like a lot of people travel with almost a checklist of motivated by needing to go to all the places where they've seen other people post pictures and take those same pictures themselves. And of course, that's a fun thing to do. But I would say that Alaska is absolutely full of amazing sights that will just blow your mind. So if you get so caught up in only looking for the list of what you've seen other people post, you're really going to miss out. So I hope this doesn't feel like a cop-out, but I would say the places to look for are the pullouts on the highways here. That's easiest to do if you're driving yourself around, which I'd absolutely encourage people to rent a car and do. But if you're on a tour, then a lot of the time, if they're going to take a break, they might choose one of these larger pullouts. And the especially scenic pullouts are marked with a highway sign that has just a picture of a camera on it. So you couldn't stop at all of them because there are too many. But if you were to make it a point to stop there when you want a rest break, there's almost always going to be some kind of a gorgeous view. You know, just like warning signs for dangerous things here. If we put a scenic view sign on all the scenic views up here, we wouldn't have a budget for that. You couldn't afford enough signs. So if they've gone to the trouble of putting up one of those signs with a camera on it, then you know you're almost always in for something good. Sometimes maybe the terrain has changed and there are trees that have grown up to obscure what used to be a very clear view. But 99% of the time, if you see one of those signs, you'll find something beautiful.
I think that's really good advice. I think sometimes, we go in and we overplan and we have too many things that we want to check off. And it just sounds like what you've talked about is that you're totally surrounded by beauty and you can almost just live in the moment and just sort of take it all in and see what comes as you're driving along. I think that's really good advice. But I am going to ask you, are there any hidden gems that we could put on our list?
Snorkeling.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Believe it or not, in Ketchikan,
Wow.
there's one snorkeling tour that I know of in Southeast Alaska. And it's Alaska. Our glaciers that shape the landscape mean that we also have a lot of silt in our water, which is basically very, very, very fine mud particles. And so you're not going to have crystal clear waters like you'd have in the Caribbean. They're not going to be warm, so they put you in thick wetsuits to get you out there. But you can snorkel in Alaska. And I was shocked by having the opportunity to do it. And so I just love it. I think it's both a hidden gem and a highlight. Another example would be up in Fairbanks. There's a place called Running Reindeer Ranch where you can actually hang out with a herd of reindeer and go for a walk through the forest with them. And
I want to do that.
It's amazing. And when I first heard about it, I thought, well, that seems nice, but it's not very exciting. And then I went and I did it, and I couldn't stop going, I'm in a forest with reindeer. It's amazing. And they get zoomies. So anybody who has a cat or a dog and they're used to the way they just dart around in a frenzy of energy, reindeer do that too. And so you'll be sort of walking through the forest and then there's this thundering, galloping herd of reindeer that goes zooming past you. And, they are a breeding herd, so sometimes there are babies also. And the female reindeer keep their antlers year round, but the males don't. And so sometimes there'll be the male reindeer with they get bigger antlers than the females, and it'll be covered in this beautiful velvety textured sort of blood supply tissue, which is actually called velvet in the right season. And it's magnificent. They're very regal looking until they sort of bonk into you by mistake, and they tell you how to handle it. So it's not dangerous, but it's really exciting and unexpected. And then a lot of places, I'll stop after this, I promise, maybe, but a lot of places around the state will have various wildlife conservation facilities. And I personally am not a fan of what I suppose you would call gratuitous zoos, right? I personally don't feel there's any reason to have animals in captivity if they don't need to be. But these facilities aren't like that. They are either rehabilitation centers or for animals that can then be released back into the wild, or they are sometimes a rescue center to provide a home for animals that would not have been able to survive in the wild. And they are a place to have guaranteed sightings of eagles, bears, muskoxen, moose, wolves, depending on where you are in the state. They're not all together in all the centers. But to name one specific one, here in South Central, there's a place called the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. And so, for example, the bears that you see there are usually they were orphaned cubs that would not have survived in the wild.
Yeah.
Nobody likes to see animals behind bars, but in this case, it's much better to be living in a large natural enclosure. And they also help with research. So, for example, up here, bears getting into refuse is a really big issue. And so the local trash companies will take their trash containers, they make bear-proof trash containers, and they will actually take it to the Wildlife Conservation Center, and they will put something tasty or something that smells tasty in there, and then they put it in the bear's enclosure, and it's kind of a win-win. The bears get a treat if they can get in there, and at the same time, they're very motivated to get in there, so they're helping the companies figure out whether these receptacles can actually resist a hungry bear in the natural environment too.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Lisa. Never did I think we'd be talking about snorkeling on this episode. There's so many great recommendations in there.
Yeah, for sure. For a trip to remember, Alaska is hard to beat. Think breathtaking views of the Northern Lights, epic road trips across the Denali Highway, and charming small towns playing host to quirky festivals. Discover all this and more with DK Eyewitness Alaska.
Okay, Lisa, so you've done a really good job of selling Alaska to us. We all really want to visit. When is the best time to visit?
Okay, so it depends on what you want to do. People are sometimes crushed to find out that you usually cannot see the Northern Lights and watch bears at the same time. And that's because life up here is very, very seasonal. And so those two things are happening at opposite ends of the year. So I would say that for the Northern Lights, we'll just start there because it's a more clear-cut answer. Northern Lights season, quote unquote, tends to run from mid-August to mid-April, but if you can go in the middle of that season, you'll have better odds of seeing them. And it's not that they're not shining all the time. It's more that the sky isn't dark enough during the summer to actually see them. And the further north you go, the darker it gets in around the winter solstice, the longer the nighttime will be. So if you can come, say January or February, is probably the perfect time to see the Northern Lights. It'll be cold, but it's worth it because when it's cold, it usually means the skies are clear. And because it's winter, the skies will be dark. And so that gives you a very good chance of seeing them. I think that in Fairbanks, I forget the exact number, but they say something along the lines of if you stay for 3 nights and you're actively looking for the Northern Lights during that season, then there's a very higher than 90% chance that you're going to see them. So that's for winter visits. For summer visits, it kind of depends on what you want to do. I love traveling in the low season. And so if your biggest ambition is to be here and to sort of see nature, I would say come in September because you'll be right at the cusp where prices are starting to go down. But if you come in early September, then most tourist activities will still be open. If you go much later than that, then again, we're so seasonal that a lot of those things are not open year round. They will have closed. If you want to do any of the iconic Alaska summer things, then come in July or August, because that is when the salmon will be running, which means the bears will be fishing for the salmon. So they'll all be clustered together in easy places for you to view. If you're fishing, that's when the fishing is always good, but that's when it's at its best and its easiest. Bird watchers actually come here a lot, and they might want to come a little earlier. They might want to come in May when a lot of the seasonal birds are passing through, but there are still a lot of resident birds that you can see in July and August. And then toward August, we'll start to go into our fall season toward the end of the month, and that is a particularly beautiful time of year because we get some yellow in our leaves. We don't get fall colors the way that some places do with the bright reds and oranges. We don't get that in our trees. We get it in our mountains because those tiny alpine plants in the tundra, they're the ones that turn all kinds of colors. They turn purple, they turn red, they turn orange. So if you're here during the right season, it doesn't last very long, and you can't always predict it just because of it depends on what kind of snow year we've had, what the winter was like, and what kind of weather in the summer. But if you're here during the right season, it looks like somebody's taken a palette of paint and they've just splashed it across the mountains. It's one of my favorite things in the world.
Aww.
Oh,
So
that's incredible.
every season is the right season, but if you had to
Yeah.
pick for summer things, July, August, and then for Northern Lights in winter, January, February, March are the ideal time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And are there any particular events listeners should mark in their calendar if they're visiting Alaska?
Sure. So one of the biggest ones, again, going back to the winter first, is called the Iditarod Sled Dog Race. It's very, very famous. We have people from all over, and I think one year the Rookie of the Year was from Norway that come here to run it. It's called a 1,000-mile sled dog race. It's not exactly 1,000 miles, but it's very, very close. It's also controversial, so I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. A lot of people have concerns about the safety of the dogs that run the race. If you're here and you're familiar with sled dogs, you know that the thing they love more than anything is to run, so they're doing what they love. And both they and the mushers are essentially professional athletes, but that might not be everybody's cup of tea. Perhaps a little less controversial would be a carnival called Fur Rendezvous here in Anchorage, and that happens in March. So late March is Fur Rendezvous, early March is the Iditarod. Fur Rendezvous was originally, as the name suggests, it was an opportunity for trappers to come together and trade their furs. Nowadays, it's really just a zany Alaskan carnival that lasts about 10 days. My favorite thing on the planet at that event is something called outhouse racing. And it's about what it sounds like. People build outhouses, so just where you would sit to do your business, they put them on skis.
Oh.
And then they have a team of people. I think it's 4 people. It might be 6. The number of times I've watched this, you'd think I would know, but they essentially harness people to the outhouses as if they were sled dogs. You have the option of pulling or pushing the outhouse, and they send them down the race course, which is one of our streets in downtown Anchorage. They close off the street, and they put 2 posts at the end of the race course, and they send people down the course, they send outhouses down the course 2 at a time, and you have to run your outhouse down to the end and then do a really tight U-turn around the pole, which is where a lot of disasters or hilarity, depending on your perspective, happen. And then you dash all the way back, and it's just
Brilliant.
It is. It's as crazy as it sounds, and there's usually a theme because, for example, the fire department, they're usually there and they'll have working sirens and lights on their outhouse. So you've got woo, 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 as they're dashing down. Or one year there was the winners a couple of years ago were a group of fathers who wore diapers on the outside of their clothes, and they called themselves the runny diapers.
Nice.
Sorry. So there are lots of, outhouse puns that are involved there, but there are lots of other things that go on. That's just the craziest one. We have something called running of the reindeer, which is meant to be modeled after the running of the bulls in Spain, but it's really just reindeer, which are not, they just want to go running, or maybe in some cases get away from all the people that are chasing them. They're like, why are we doing this? But it gets a lot of people excited to see if they can outrun the reindeer as you're going down the main street. So things like that. That's the winter time. In the summertime, one more winter one, if it's okay, in Haines, Alaska, which is a small town at the north end of the Inside Passage in Southeast Alaska. They have a bald eagle preserve where you will see hundreds of bald eagles that have gathered together because there's a stretch of water that stays open throughout the winter, so they can still catch fish there. So that is an amazing place to go in the winter. I believe early February is sort of the peak season for that, but I wouldn't take my word entirely on that. I would double check. But just throughout the season, going to see all these eagles gathering. If you've dreamed of seeing one eagle, why not go where you can see hundreds all at once?
That sounds incredible, yeah.
It is. It is. During the winter, I think a lot of people might enjoy just coming here for the summer solstice to see what that's like. Because if you don't live at a northern latitude, if you do, I know that, for example, in the UK, you're going to have longer days and shorter winters, but we take it to an extreme, especially if you go to a northern part of the state. For example, the northernmost community is Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, so you might be familiar with it by either name. And during the summer, they have the literal 24-hour sunlight. The sun never sets below the horizon.
Amazing.
It just sort of, it gets a little higher in the sky and then it gets a little lower in the sky as it goes around, but it never actually sets.
Oh, wow.
So wherever you choose, even here in Anchorage, we're pretty far south in the state, but we don't get 24 hours of full daylight, but we get 24 hours of usable light. So you can be outside at midnight or 2 in the morning and not need a headlamp or a flashlight or anything like that. So the summer solstice, I would say, is the biggest thing to look out for. We also have a range of music festivals here, and I don't think that I wouldn't recommend anyone traveling only for the music festival necessarily.
Sure.
Maybe that's somebody's
Yeah.
jam. But if you're here anyway, then it's a really interesting way to meet people and just kind of rub shoulders or elbows with the locals for a little while.
Amazing. It sounds like such a packed calendar of events, and all of them I want to go to. They all sound great. Okay, so coming back to hiking, your favorite subject, are there any sort of practical tips that you could share with listeners?
Sure. So the first is just to remember that, again, unless you're coming from a very wilderness intensive place, then hiking in Alaska is probably not going to be quite like hiking where you're used to. There will probably be fewer signs telling you which way to go. There will probably be fewer switchbacks. We're working on that. There are hardworking trail crews that are putting in beautiful switchback trails, but a lot of the older trails, if you're kind of trying to get off the beaten path, some of those still just go straight up the mountain. So just fair warning about that. And lastly, it's really an uncontrolled environment, and it's not unusual to hear visitors come and say things like, well, where can we see the moose, or what time do they let the moose out, what time do they let the bears out? And to me, that just tells me that both of us, myself and this visitor, we're used to living in very different environments, right? So for me, it's normal that things just come and go whenever they feel like it. And maybe for them, it's more normal that life happens at a more scheduled pace. So when you do go hiking up here, just know that it is very much an uncontrolled environment. So you could see wildlife at any time, or you could not. It's always a gamble. That's part of what makes it exciting. If you do happen to see wildlife, as far as practical tips, it is definitely useful to keep in mind that you want to give them plenty of space. Again, if somebody's used to only seeing animals in context of a controlled environment, then they might be thinking that it's safe to get up close to them. And here it's really not. And you can't even, you can say things like, if a moose puts its ears back at you, it's probably angry. If a moose raises its hackles, so the fur along the back of its shoulders, if that's standing up, it's true. If that happens, they're probably angry and you want to get far away. But you can't count on the idea that a moose, for example, is actually relaxed because it looks relaxed. They're famous for having hair triggers, and they're built to withstand bears and wolves, if you think about it. So a lot of locals would actually tell you that moose are scarier than bears. And I would agree with that, actually. So just know, especially, I'm harping on moose. I feel like I'm harping a little bit, but it's because people see them and they're like, oh, look, it's giant Bambi. It's giant ugly Bambi. Let's go take a picture. It's just a deer. It's fine. And and the truth is that you don't want to do that. So whatever wildlife you see, give them plenty of space. Just let them do their thing. This is where a zoom lens comes in really handy. Or even on phones nowadays, the resolution for the camera is so good that you can probably zoom in and still have an amazing photo, but you'll be safe while you get it because we want you to stay alive and we want you to come back. And
Yes, please, listeners, heed this advice.
we have all kinds of wildlife up here. So, depending on where you go, you might see beavers, you might see porcupines, you could see bald eagles. We have ospreys, we have sandhill cranes, we have wolverines, we have wolves. I could go on. There's just so much here. So, be aware of the wildlife, learn basic wildlife manners, but also don't forget about the little guys. Don't forget about the things that aren't bears and moose because you can see so much up here if you're looking for it.
Oh, that's such good advice.
That's all sage advice. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. You might have covered this perhaps, or it's on a sort of related note, but we always like to ask just at the close of the show what visitors can do to have a positive impact when they travel to the state.
I love that you do that, and I really enjoy hearing what people say about it. I feel like one of the best things visitors can do while they're here is really just say hello to people. And I say that
Ah, that's
because
nice.
we get a lot of visitors on cruise ships. And I've cruised myself, so I can understand how it's a bit like you've just been teleported from one place to another, and the cruise ship life is meant to feel like an insulating, all-encompassing, all-providing bubble, right? So you don't have to even think about your needs. And that feeling can definitely persist when you're on a land tour or you're even out in the community before or after your cruise. And so I've had the very strange experience of, say, sitting in a small town like Talkeetna and watching buses of cruise ship visitors come in, and then they sort of walk down the main street and they don't even notice they're walking in the street. And they look at you, and for me, I've had them look at me as if I were part of the scenery. I could almost hear their mental narration saying, there's a scruffy local Alaskan in her natural habitat, sitting at a table eating lunch by the side of the road. Let's not approach too closely or move quickly. We don't want to startle her. And so I can definitely understand how it would feel that way, or maybe people might also be worried about seeming rude or too forward or bothering people. But we're very friendly up here. And it's true that in the larger cities, you might get people who are used to just sort of walking on by or, not really acknowledging you. But it's very much the social norm to make eye contact, at least nod your head. You don't have to have a long conversation, but it's normal up here to acknowledge people's presence. And I think because we do get a lot of visitors who tend to not do that for any of the many reasons, then it's really a pleasure and a delight to us here when people do acknowledge us and just take the time to say hi. Because guess what? We'd probably love to know where you're coming from and learn something about your home too. Just engage with us, please. Say hello,
Yes.
ask questions, and shop local if you can. That's a
Yeah.
very, very big thing, especially in the cruise ports. But not only, there will be places that try to pass off cheaply made imitations from elsewhere as Alaskan artwork. It's especially an issue for Alaskan Native artwork. So please, please ask questions about the artists. If you're looking for examples of Alaska Native handiwork, go to gift shops that are actually run by Alaska Native organizations. And that way you'll be sure that you're getting an authentic souvenir of your once-in-a-lifetime trip or hopefully trip of a lifetime that you repeat several times. Because I cannot think of anything more heartbreaking than being here and thinking that you've bought a beautiful example of Alaska Native artwork or an Alaska-made souvenir made by a local artist and then getting home and finding out that's actually not the case. So, shop local, ask questions. If they can answer your questions in a relaxed way, then they're probably authentic. That's the easiest way to make sure. If they're giving you a hard sell or they're pressuring you in any way, they're not being honest, and go next door because probably the next door shop will be better.
Thank you, Lisa. That's really nice, thoughtful, but also very easily actionable advice. That's a really nice answer. Thank you so much. And so concludes our episode. So thank you, Lisa. That was an amazing tour around Alaska. There's so much now that I want to do.
Oh, for sure. Thank you. I feel like I know the States so much better than I did at the start of the show. That was really brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being interested. I'm just so excited. Maybe you'll come visit someday.
Oh, thank you so much to Lisa. I think that was an absolutely fantastic episode. I really feel like I was transported to a frozen wonderland. It was just beautiful. You can find more of Lisa's work at hikingalaska.net and maloneyWrites.com.
Listener, join us next episode as we enjoy sunnier climes exploring Malaysia in the final episode of the season. You can also vote for us in the British Podcast Awards Listeners' Choice Awards. So go vote for us. Thanks so much for your support, and we'll see you next episode. This podcast was produced by Julia Baker and me, Bella Talbot. For more information about DKI Witness, visit dk.com/travel and follow us on social media at DKI Witness. Please rate, review and follow the show. Your support means so much to us.